Caleb Walker's knees hit the dirt beside a shallow grave. A lifeless black colt, wrapped in flour sacking, cradled against his chest, when a woman's voice tore through the morning stillness. "Don't you dare cover him!" Evelyn Harper came running down the creek bank barefoot, her nightdress soaked to the knee, and tore the shovel from his hands before the first mound of earth could fall. "He's not dead," she said, pressing 2 fingers beneath the colt's jaw. "Not yet. If this story pulls at your heart, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled." The shovel was already in the dirt when Evelyn Harper's scream cut through the morning. "Don't you dare cover him!" Caleb Walker froze with his boot still braced against the blade, sweat cutting a clean line down the dust on his neck. He turned his head just enough to see a woman running down the creek bank barefoot, her nightdress soaked through at the hem, her gray-streaked hair loose and wild around her shoulders. She was not young. She was not graceful. She ran like a woman who had forgotten just for a moment that she was 40 years old and supposed to know better. "Ma'am, I don't know you." Caleb said, his voice flat and worn thin, "And I'd thank you kindly to let me finish what I came here to do." "What you came here to do is bury something that isn't dead yet." She dropped to her knees in the dirt beside him, heedless of her nightdress, heedless of the shovel still gripped in his fists. Her hands went straight for the flour sack in his arms, and when he pulled back from her, something close to anger flared in his chest. "He's been still since sunup," Caleb said. Doc Pruitt looked at him himself, said there weren't nothing to be done. "Doc Pruitt treats cattle with a broken leg and calls it a day's work," Evelyn said. "He wouldn't know a fading pulse from a dead one if it bit him." "And you would." "My father bred horses for 30 years in Kentucky before he ever set foot in this territory. I held foals dying in my arms before I could walk to school by myself." She was not asking permission now. Her hands moved to the sacking, peeling it back from the colt's face with a gentleness that did not match the fire in her voice a moment before. "Let me look at him. If I'm wrong, I'll help you dig the grave myself." Caleb's jaw worked. He looked at the shallow hole he'd already carved into the earth beneath the old cottonwood, the same tree where he'd buried his wife's mother's rosary 3 years back after the fever took Sarah from him, the same creek where he used to bring Sarah on Sunday afternoons before the ranch swallowed every hour he had. He looked at the woman kneeling in the dirt beside him, a stranger uninvited, already touching the one thing he had left of Sarah's bloodline. "You're that widow?" he said slowly. "Harper. Live up past the ridge." "Evelyn Harper. And you're wasting time arguing with me instead of letting me work." "Work on what? He's dead, ma'am. I felt him go cold myself." "Cold isn't dead. Cold is cold." She pressed 2 fingers beneath the colt's jaw, closed. Her eyes went so still that Caleb found himself holding his own breath without meaning to. The creek moved behind them. Somewhere a meadowlark called and went quiet. Evelyn's face did not change for a long moment, long enough that Caleb felt his chest tighten with something he didn't want to name hope, maybe, or the fear of hope, which after Sarah's death had become the same thing to him. "There," Evelyn breathed. "There. Feel that." "Feel what?" "Give me your hand." "Ma'am." "Give me your hand, Mr. Walker, or I swear I will drag it there myself." He gave her his hand. She pressed his rough fingers into the soft hollow beneath the colt's jaw, held them there, and for a moment, Caleb felt nothing but the give of cold flesh and his own pulse hammering in his fingertips from the argument. Then, so faint he thought at first it was his imagination, or his own heartbeat playing tricks on him, he felt it. A flutter, small as a moth against a windowpane, gone almost before he was sure of it. Then again, his breath left him all at once. "That's—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "That's a heartbeat, Mr. Walker. Barely one, but a heartbeat all the same." Evelyn's eyes came up to his, and there was no triumph in them, only urgency. "He is not gone. He is dying, which is a different thing entirely, and dying can sometimes be stopped." "Doc said," Doc Pruitt has never in his life warmed a newborn foal back from the edge of death, and I have done it 4 times with my own 2 hands. Twice I lost them. Twice I didn't. I am not asking you to trust a miracle, Mr. Walker. I'm asking you to trust that a beating heart is worth more effort than a shovel. Caleb looked down at the small black head resting against the flower, sacking the delicate curve of the colt's ear, the whirl of dark hair between his eyes that was so like his mother's, so like the mare that had been Sarah's favorite before the drought took half the herd and grief took the rest. He thought of how he'd carried the colt down here that morning with his throat too tight to speak, thinking this was the last piece of Sarah's world he had left to bury, and how he had told himself that once this was done, he could finally stop hoping for things that weren't coming back. "What do you want me to do?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. It was closer to surrender. "Carry him, now. Not tomorrow, not after you finish thinking it over. Now." Evelyn was already rising, already reaching to help him lift the small body without jostling it too hard. "My cabin's closer than the ranch house. We don't have time to argue about pride." "I don't need charity. This isn't charity, Mr. Walker. This is triage, and I'd be obliged if you'd stop confusing the two." She was walking already, her bare feet sure over the rocky ground, despite the pace, and Caleb found himself following with the colt cradled against his chest before he'd fully decided to. "You always talk to strangers like this." Only the ones about to bury something that's still breathing. They walked without speaking. After that, the only sound, the creek falling away behind them, and Caleb's own boots in the dirt, heavy with the weight of a decision he hadn't quite agreed to make. When they reached her cabin, small weathered a porch that sagged at one corner, and a garden gone to seed along the side. Evelyn was already pushing the door open, already clearing a space by the stove, with one sweep of her arm that sent a stack of mending tumbling to the floor without so much as a glance back at it. "Here, lay him here, close to the heat, not on it." Caleb knelt and set the colt down as gently as he could manage with hands that had gone unsteady. "He's shivering. That's good. Shivering means the body's still fighting to warm itself. It's the ones that stop shivering you need to worry over." Evelyn was already moving, pulling quilts from a chest by the wall, an old flannel shirt from a hook by the door. Anything soft she could lay her hands on. "I need water heated, not boiling, just warm as a bath, and I need you to keep talking to him." Talking to him. Horses know voices before they know faces, Mr. Walker. If this colt is going to fight his way back, he needs a reason to. Give him one. Caleb stared at her like she'd asked him to recite scripture in a language he'd never learned. "I don't know what to say to a half-dead horse." "Then say his name. Does he have one?" "No." Wasn't going to name something that was born looking like it wouldn't see noon. Something in Evelyn's face tightened quick and gone. "Well, he's seen past noon already, hasn't he? Name him something, Mr. Walker, and say it like you mean it." Caleb looked down at the colt's small chest, rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, at the dark coat gone dull with cold, and thought of the mare Sarah used to sing to in the barn on winter evenings. Thought of ash gone cold in a stove that still had one live coal buried somewhere beneath it, if you knew where to look. "Ember," he said quietly. "I'll call him Ember." "Then say it to him, now, while I get this water." He did feeling foolish. Feeling something crack open in his chest that he'd kept sealed shut since the day they lowered Sarah into the ground. "Ember," he murmured, low and rough, his hand resting against the colt's damp neck. "Ember, you hang on now, you hear me? You hang on." Evelyn returned with the basin of water and a stack of cloths, kneeling across from him without a word, about the break in his voice, without making him feel smaller for it. She dipped a cloth, wrung it, began working it in slow circles over the colt's legs, his chest, the long line of his spine. "You're rubbing him," Caleb said. "Circulation. Cold blood pools if you let it sit still. We have to keep it moving, keep the heart remembering it has work to do." She glanced up at him. "Your hands are bigger than mine. Take the other side." "I don't know the first thing about—" "You know how to rub down a horse after a hard ride, don't you? It's not so different. Watch me first if you need to." He watched her for a moment, the sureness of her movements, the way she never once flinched from the cold, wet weight of a dying animal, the way her mouth moved in a constant low murmur to the Colt, even as her hands worked words too quiet for Caleb to catch, but steady as a heartbeat themselves. Then he took up a cloth of his own and began. "You said you lost 2, Caleb said, after a while not looking at her, focused on the slow drag of the cloth over Ember's foreleg. "Foals, you said. You lost 2. "I did." "How do you keep doing it then? Trying, after losing that many?" Evelyn was quiet long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. "Because the 2 I saved wouldn't exist if I'd decided beforehand that trying wasn't worth the grief of losing," she said finally. "My husband used to say I had more stubbornness than sense. He wasn't wrong, but stubbornness is what keeps a heart beating sometimes. Mr. Walker, when sense has already given up and gone home. Your husband, where's he now?" "Dead 5 years. Fever same as half this territory that year." She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, without pausing in her work. "I expect that's a story you know something about yourself, given the way you flinched when I mentioned your wife's mare." Caleb's hands stilled on the Colt's flank. "How'd you know about Sarah?" "Everybody this side of the ridge knows about Sarah Walker. Kindest woman in the county, they say. Died of the same fever, same year as my Thomas." Evelyn's eyes lifted to his steady unflinching. "I never got the chance to meet her. Folks say she'd have liked this Colt named for something warm instead of something dead." Caleb said nothing to that. His throat had closed too tight to trust his own voice, and he bent his head back to the work of his hands, rubbing warmth into a small cold body that did not yet know it was allowed to live. They worked through the better part of an hour. Like that, mostly silent, the fire in the stove popping now and then. Evelyn's murmured words to the Colt, filling the spaces where conversation might otherwise have gone. Caleb found himself watching her more than he meant to. The set of her jaw, the way exhaustion had carved lines around her eyes that told him she hadn't slept easy in a long while herself, the way she never once complained about the ache that must have been building in her knees from kneeling so long on a hard floor. "You've done this before tonight," he said. "Haven't slept. I don't sleep well most nights. Woke before dawn, same as always, saw you riding for the creek with that sack in your arms, and something told me not to look away. Lucky for Ember you didn't. Luck had very little to do with it." She wrung out her cloth again, checked the Colt's breathing with 2 fingers, pressed light against his ribs. Steadier. His breathing steadier. Caleb leaned in without meaning to close enough that he could see it himself, the small chest rising with a fraction more strength than before, the shivering easing by degrees. "You did that. We did that. Don't go handing me credit you earned yourself, Mr. Walker." "Caleb," he said. "You keep calling me Mr. Walker like I'm fixing to foreclose on you. Name's Caleb." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of Evelyn's mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "Caleb, then. We're not out of danger yet. The next few hours will tell us more than the last one did." "What happens if he doesn't?" Caleb couldn't finish it. "Then we'll have given him every chance a body could give, and there's no shame in that. But I don't intend to let this be the outcome, and I'd wager neither do you." She reached for another cloth, nodded toward the basin. "Warm that water again. We keep going till his body tells us we can stop one way or the other." Caleb rose to do as she asked, and standing there over the stove with the water warming between his hands, he found himself looking back at the small dark shape on the floor, at the woman kneeling beside it, with a devotion that owed him nothing, and felt something shift loose in his chest that had been locked tight since the day he'd stood over Sarah's grave, and told himself he was done hoping for anything this world had left to give him. He did not know yet that the fight for one small Colt's life would end up being the fight that cracked open every wall he'd built around himself since. He only knew standing there with warm water in his hands and a stranger's steady voice behind him, murmuring encouragement to a heartbeat too faint for most men to have bothered searching for at all, that he was not ready to walk away from this cabin. Not yet. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the ridge, indifferent to the small, fierce battle being fought inside 4 narrow walls, a battle for one Colt's life that neither Caleb Walker nor Evelyn Harper yet understood, was also in its own quiet way a battle for their own. Evelyn's hand shot out and caught Caleb's wrist before he'd taken 2 steps toward the stove. "Wait," she whispered. "Look." Ember's ribs stuttered, held then rose again, in a breath deeper than any he'd drawn since they'd carried him through the door. His legs, which had lain limp as rope for the better part of an hour, twitched once, twice, then folded and unfolded in a slow, uncoordinated kick against the quilt. "Is that—" Caleb couldn't finish it. "That's a Colt remembering he has legs," Evelyn said. And for the first time since he'd met her that morning, her voice cracked clean down the middle. She pressed both hands over her mouth, and above her fingers, her eyes had gone bright and wet. "Ma'am?" "Evelyn. Evelyn. You're crying." "I'm allowed." She dragged the back of her wrist across her cheek hard, like she was angry at the tears for showing themselves. "You don't spend an hour convincing a heart to keep beating and come out the other side dry-eyed, Caleb Walker. Now hush and watch him." Ember's head lifted an inch off the quilt. His nostrils flared, drawing in air like he was tasting it for the first time, and a sound came out of him, small, hoarse, more question than cry, that made both of them go dead still. "That's him talking," Evelyn breathed. "That's him telling us he's still here." Caleb knelt back down fast, his knees cracking against the floorboards, and put his hand flat against the Colt's neck, the way he had before. Except this time, he didn't need Evelyn to guide his fingers to find the pulse. It beat up against his palm. Still faint, still fragile as a moth's wing beat, but steadier now. Steadier than it had any right to be, an hour after a doctor pronounced the animal dead. "Ember," Caleb said, and his voice broke on the word, same as it had the first time. "There you are." The Colt's ears, which had lain flat and lifeless against his skull, twitched toward the sound of Caleb's voice and stayed there listening. "He knows you," Evelyn said quietly. "He's heard my voice for all of 5 minutes. Doesn't take longer than that sometimes." She was already moving again, reaching past him for a smaller cloth, folding it thin. "We're not finished. Getting him breathing is only half the fight. Now we have to get something warm into his belly, or all this work unravels by nightfall. He can't even lift his head proper. Then we help him." Evelyn nodded toward a shelf above the wash basin. "There's a tin up there, blue lid marked with an E. Bring it down." Caleb found it, brought it to her, watched her measure, careful spoonfuls of something pale and thick, into a small pot of water, warming at the edge of the stove. "What is that?" "Goat's milk honey, a bit of raw egg beaten through. My own recipe built from watching my father lose more foals than he saved before he learned better. It won't replace a mare's milk, but it'll keep a heart beating till we can get one." "You don't have a mare here that could nurse him?" "Not one fresh enough to give milk. Do you?" Caleb thought of his own herd thinned by drought and bad luck till it was barely worth calling a herd at all, and shook his head slow. "Old Bess foaled 2 years back. Dried up long since. Then this will have to do till we find another way." Evelyn tested the warmth of the mixture against the inside of her wrist, nodded to herself, and poured a small measure into a shallow dish. "Hold his head steady for me. Not too tight, just enough that he can't toss it away before he's tasted what's good for him." Caleb cupped his palm beneath Ember's jaw. Felt the Colt's whole small body trembling with the effort of simply existing, and held him with a gentleness that surprised even himself. Evelyn dipped 2 fingers into the dish and let the mixture drip slow against Ember's lips. Nothing happened. She tried again. The Colt's tongue moved sluggish, uncertain, and a thin trail of the mixture ran down his chin instead of into his mouth. "Come on now," Evelyn murmured, and there was no frustration in it. Only patience worn thin and stretched thinner. "Come on, sweetheart. You fought too hard to quit on me over a little milk." Third try. The tongue moved with more purpose. This time caught the drip, and Ember's throat worked in a small, uneven swallow. "There," Evelyn said so soft it was barely more than breath. "There he goes." It took the better part of another hour to get even a few ounces into him, drip by patient drip. Caleb's arm, going numb from holding the Colt's head steady, and neither of them caring enough to trade off the work. By the time Ember's eyes, dark unfocused, but open, blinked slow up at the 2 faces hovering over him, the light through the cabin's single window had shifted from the pale gray of early morning to the harder gold of midday. "He's looking at us." Caleb said, hardly daring to say it too loud, like speaking might scare the moment off. He's looking at you, Evelyn corrected, and there was something soft in the way she said it. Something that made Caleb glance up at her before he could stop himself. Been listening to your voice for 2 hours now. Reckon he's decided you're worth keeping his eyes open for. I didn't do the half of what you did. You did the part he needed, a voice to fight toward. She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron, and for the first time since he'd met her that morning, Caleb saw the exhaustion catch up to her. All at once, the slump of her shoulders, the way her hands shook faintly as she set the dish aside. Lord, I haven't sat still like this in longer than I can remember. You should eat something yourself. I should. I will in a minute. But she didn't move, and neither did he, and for a long moment the two of them simply sat on the floor of a stranger's cabin with a half-dead colt breathing steady between them, saying nothing at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that the quiet wasn't already saying better. It was Ember who broke it with a small indignant sound, and an attempt to shove his nose against Caleb's hand that was more will than strength. He wants more, Evelyn said, laughing a real laugh surprised out of her the first Caleb had heard from her all morning. Greedy already. That's a good sign, Caleb. That's the best sign we could ask for. You think he'll truly make it not just through today? Evelyn considered the question with the same care she'd given everything else that morning, unwilling to hand out false comfort, even when comfort was what he was asking for. I think he's got more fight in him than most creatures twice his size. I think the next 3 days will tell us more than I can promise you right now. But I think... She paused, looking down at the colt, then up at Caleb. I think whatever brought you down to that creek an hour later than you meant to be there, whatever made me wake before dawn and look out my window at exactly the right moment, I don't believe that was luck alone. I've buried enough to know the difference between luck and something else. Caleb didn't have an answer for that. He looked down at Ember instead, at the small dark head resting heavy and trusting against his palm, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been wound tight for 3 long years. Thank you, he said finally, for not looking away. Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road before this colt's out of danger, and I intend to see it through to the end. That means you're going to be back here tomorrow morning. Caleb Walker, whether you like it or not. Because a colt this fragile needs feeding through the night, and I can't do it alone forever. I wasn't planning on going anywhere else. Something passed between them, then quick, unspoken, gone before either of them could name it, and Evelyn looked away first, busying her hands with the empty dish color rising faint in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. Well, she said briskly, go on home and get some rest yourself then. I'll sit up with him tonight. You will not sit up alone. I'll come back after supper. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I'm going to anyway. He said it plain, the way a man says something he's already decided and doesn't intend to argue further, and Evelyn's mouth opened like she meant to protest before she thought better of it and closed it again. Suit yourself, she said instead, and something in her voice had gone warmer than it had been an hour before. He came back that evening with a lantern and a sack of feed he'd scraped together from his own dwindling stores, and found Evelyn exactly where he'd left her, kneeling on the floor beside a colt who had in the hours since found the strength to lift his head unassisted and hold it there. He's stronger, Caleb said, setting the lantern down. He's a fighter. Told you he had it in him. Evelyn glanced up at him at the sack in his hands, and her brow furrowed. You didn't need to bring feed. I have enough. You have enough for one horse eating light, not enough for a colt about to eat like he's making up for lost time. He set the sack by the door. Least I can do. You already did the least you could do riding out here twice in one day, when most men would have called it charity enough to leave a colt to a stranger's care. He's not a stranger's colt. He's mine. Makes him my responsibility, same as yours now that you've gone and made yourself part of keeping him alive. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, before she nodded slow and went back to checking the poultice she'd wrapped around one of Ember's forelegs, where the cold had bitten hardest. They fell into it easy after that, a rhythm neither of them planned, but both of them fell into, like it had always been there waiting. Caleb came at dawn before his own chores, and again after supper, and somewhere in the space of that first week, Evelyn stopped protesting his visits and started simply expecting them setting a second cup out for coffee before he'd even knocked. By the fourth day, Ember could stand on legs that wobbled but held. By the sixth, he took his first unsteady steps across the cabin floor, and Evelyn laughed so hard at the sight of him tottering sideways into a chair leg that Caleb found himself laughing along with her before he'd even realized his own chest had unclenched enough to allow it. "Look at him," she said, wiping her eyes. "Thinks he's already grown. Give him a week, he'll be trying to outrun me to the feed bag. Give him a month, he'll be trying to outrun that mare of yours." Evelyn caught herself smiling too wide too easy and busied her hands with straightening a blanket that didn't need straightening. "You should be proud, Caleb. Not many men would have stopped digging when a strange woman came screaming down a creek bank at them. Not many women would have come screaming down a creek bank in the first place. I've been called worse things than strange for less. I didn't mean it as an insult. I know you didn't." She looked at him, then steadied something warmer than gratitude in her face. "It's been a long while since anybody looked at me like what I did mattered, instead of like I was just an old widow with too much time and too little sense. You're not old. I'm 40, Caleb. Some in this town would call that old for a woman with no husband and no children to speak for her. Then some in this town don't know what they're talking about." He said it firm, almost sharp, and Evelyn blinked at the edge in his voice like she hadn't expected it. "You're kinder than the last 3 years have made most men around here," she said quietly. "Maybe the last 3 years just hadn't given me a reason to be anything else." Neither of them said anything more about it, but the silence that followed sat differently than the silences before. It had softer, fuller, the kind of quiet two people share when they've said more than they meant to and aren't sorry for it. It was in that second week with Ember steady enough to be left in a stall Caleb had built onto the side of Evelyn's cabin that Caleb first noticed the state of the place around him, really noticed it the way a man notices things, once his own grief has loosened its grip enough to let him see past the end of his own nose. The porch sagged bad enough that one more hard winter would take it down entirely. The roof had a patch over the kitchen gone soft and dark with old water damage. The garden along the side, the one Evelyn had clearly once tended with care, had gone to weed and neglect, choked with things that hadn't been planted on purpose. "Your roof's rotting," he said one morning, tipping his head back to squint at the dark patch above the stove. "I'm aware." "You haven't had it fixed." "I haven't had the money to have it fixed, and I haven't had a husband in 5 years to fix it himself. And I've made do with a bucket under the worst of the leak, same as I've made do with most things since Thomas passed." She said it without self-pity, matter-of-fact as reporting the weather, but Caleb heard the years of hard scraping folded into those few words all the same. "I could fix it." "Caleb, wasn't asking permission, telling you what I'm doing tomorrow." He nodded toward the fence line, half of it leaning drunk against nothing, rails gone gray and split with age. "Fence needs work too, and that garden's got good soil under all that weed if somebody took a hoe to it before the season gets too far along. You've got your own ranch to see to. My own ranch has been running on grief and stubbornness for 3 years, and I expect it'll keep running on grief and stubbornness for 1 more week while I fix what needs fixing here. Man's got to have something to do with his hands besides feeling sorry for himself." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue further, then looked at him, really looked the way she'd looked at Ember that first morning, checking for something beneath the surface, and whatever she found there made her close her mouth again and simply nod. "Well," she said, "if you're determined to make yourself useful, I won't stand in the way of it. But I'll feed you proper for the trouble. A man doesn't fix a roof on an empty stomach in my house." "Never said no to a good meal in my life." "Good, because I intend to hold you to that fence line too, and it'll take more than 1 morning." It took, in truth, most of 2 weeks, the roof first, then the fence, then the garden, turned over row by row, while Ember grew steadier and bolder in the yard beside them, testing his legs in short, clumsy sprints that made Evelyn laugh every single time without fail. The work gave Caleb's hands something honest to do, and it gave the two of them hours together that neither planned but neither cut short. Either hours filled with coffee, gone cold on the porch rail, with stories traded slow and careful, the kind of stories people don't hand out to strangers. "Thomas and I never had children," Evelyn told him one afternoon, pulling weeds from a row of beans with quick, practiced hands. "Tried for years. Wasn't meant to be, I suppose. There was a stretch of time I thought that was the cruelest thing life could hand a woman. Now I think maybe it just meant God had other plans for who I'd end up caring for." Like a half-dead colt. Like a half-dead colt and a stubborn rancher who won't let a woman fix her own roof. She glanced sideways at him, a smile tugging at her mouth. "What about you and Sarah? Did you two—" "We wanted a family. Never got the chance before the fever took her." Caleb's hand stilled on the fence post he was setting, and for a moment his voice went distant, the way it always did when Sarah's name came up unprompted. "Sometimes I think that's the part that eats at me worst. Not just losing her. Losing every version of a life we were supposed to build together that never got the chance to happen." "I understand that better than most," Evelyn said softly. "Grief for what happened is one thing. Grief for what never got to happen is a whole different animal, and it doesn't heal the same way." "No, it doesn't." He looked at her then, and something passed between them again, quicker this time, harder to look away from. "You're the first person I've said that to out loud. 3 years and you're the first." "Then I'm glad you said it to me." Ember chose that moment to come barreling across the yard on legs still a touch too long for his body, bumping hard into Caleb's shins with a force that nearly toppled him, and the moment broke into laughter. Instead, easy, unguarded laughter that Caleb realized with something like shock he hadn't produced in longer than he could remember. "He's got no manners at all," Evelyn said, scratching behind the colt's ear as he leaned his whole weight into her hand. "Wonder where he gets that from. Don't you dare say from me." "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." "Evelyn. Evelyn." He said her name slow, like he was testing the shape of it, and something in the way he said it made her look down at the colt instead of at him, her cheeks gone warm despite the cool morning air. It was good those weeks. Simple and good in a way neither of them had let themselves have in years. And if either of them noticed how easily the days folded into each other. How naturally Caleb's morning visits stretched into afternoons. How Evelyn had started setting a place for him at supper. Without being asked if either of them noticed, neither said a word about it, content to let something fragile and unnamed grow in the quiet spaces between coffee cups and fence rails, and the small, insistent demands of a colt who refused to let either of them sit still with their sorrow for very long. But a town like theirs did not run on quiet for long. It ran as most small frontier towns did, on eyes at windows and tongues, loosened over church suppers and general store counters. And it was inevitable, though neither Caleb nor Evelyn saw it coming, that someone would notice a rancher's horse tied outside a widow's cabin morning after morning, week after week, and decide that noticing was the same as knowing. It started small, the way these things always did. Caleb rode into town on a Saturday for supplies. He could no longer put off buying nails for the last stretch of fence flower, a length of rope, and found the general store quieter than usual when he stepped through the door. Not silent, just quieter, in the particular way a room goes quiet when the people in it have just stopped talking about the person who walked in. "Morning, Caleb," said Hiram Doyle, the store owner, from behind the counter, his voice a shade too bright. "Hiram?" Caleb nodded to him, then to the two women near the fabric bolts, who suddenly found their conversation with each other very absorbing. "Ladies." Neither of them met his eye. He filled his order without thinking much of it. A man could imagine slights where none existed, he told himself, and a store full of women minding their own business wasn't proof of anything. But as Hiram wrapped his purchases, the older of the two women, Mrs. Fenwick, a woman Caleb had known since before Sarah passed, spoke just loud enough to be heard. "Some folks don't waste much time, do they?" she said to her companion, not quite looking at Caleb, not quite not looking at him either. "Man barely 3 years widowed, already spending every morning up at that Harper woman's place. Whole town's talking about it." "Margaret, hush," her companion whispered, though not quite quiet enough. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, gathering his goods and settling his account with Hiram, who wouldn't meet his eyes either. "That'll be all for you, Caleb," Hiram said, too fast, sliding the change across the counter without letting his fingers linger. Reckon it will. Caleb picked up his supplies, tipped his hat to the room in general, and walked out into the street with his shoulders squared and his blood running hot beneath a face that gave nothing away. He didn't tell Evelyn about it that evening. Told himself there was nothing to tell idle gossip from bored women with nothing better to fill their afternoons, the kind of talk that would burn itself out inside a week once something more interesting came along to chew on. But he noticed riding home that night how the lantern light in a neighboring cabin window seemed to track his passage a shade too long, how a curtain twitched in a house he passed that had never twitched before. It was Evelyn who felt it first in truth, though it took her longer to name what she was feeling. It started with small things. The seamstress, who usually took in her mending on Tuesdays, sent word she was too busy this month to accept new work. The Ladies' Aid Society, which Evelyn had belonged to since before Thomas's death, somehow forgot to send word of their monthly meeting, though every other member received their notice, same as always. A neighbor who'd borrowed her good preserving pot the previous autumn returned it on her porch step without a knock, without a word, as though even that small exchange had become something to avoid. I don't understand it, Evelyn said one evening, turning the returned pot over in her hands, like it might explain itself. Martha Coyle and I have traded pots and recipes for 6 years running. She's never once left without stopping to talk. Maybe she was in a hurry. Maybe. But Evelyn's voice carried a doubt that told Caleb she didn't believe it any more than he did. The following week it sharpened into something harder to explain away. Evelyn went into town for thread, and found the shopkeeper's wife suddenly occupied with inventory in the back room, leaving her husband to serve Evelyn with an apology so thin it barely qualified as one. She went to collect eggs she'd arranged to buy from the Petersons, a standing order 5 years old, and found the arrangement quietly canceled, no explanation offered beyond a mumbled excuse about the hens not laying enough to spare. They have more eggs than they know what to do with, Evelyn told Caleb that evening, her voice tight in a way he hadn't heard from her before, not even in the worst hours of Ember's fight for life. I've bought from them every week for 5 years. Something's not right, Caleb. You think it's about... He didn't finish it, didn't want to say the thing out loud and give it more weight than it already carried. About you visiting my cabin every morning? About the whole town watching a widow and a widower spend their days together without a chaperone or a wedding band between them? Evelyn's laugh came out bitter. Nothing like the easy laughter Caleb had grown used to over the past weeks. I'd wondered when it would catch up to us. Small towns don't let two lonely people find comfort in each other without deciding they've got a right to an opinion about it. Nobody's got a right to starve you out of eggs and thread over it. No, they don't. But rights and what actually happens in a town like this are two very different animals, and I learned that lesson a long while before you rode down to my creek with a dead colt in your arms. She set the empty egg basket down harder than it needed, setting her hands not quite steady. I've survived being talked about before. I'll survive it again. You shouldn't have to. No, I shouldn't. But wanting a thing different doesn't make it different, Caleb, and I'd rather face it plain than pretend it isn't happening. She looked at him, then something fierce and tired in her eyes at once. The question is whether you're prepared for what it'll cost you being seen with a woman this town has already decided to judge. I don't much care what this town's decided. You will. Everybody does eventually. It wears a person down being watched and whispered about day after day. I won't have you resenting me for it later, once the shine's worn off standing beside me. Evelyn. He said her name firm enough to stop her mid-sentence. I buried a wife 3 years ago and told myself that was the last time I'd let myself feel anything worth losing. You want to know what this town's opinion is worth to me, less than the sound of that Colt out there stamping his feet because he wants his supper. Less than the sound of you laughing at something fool thing he does in the yard. I'm not walking away from that because a handful of gossips in a general store have decided they've got nothing better to do with their tongues. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, something bright and unsteady in her eyes that she blinked back hard before it could fall. You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow too, and the day after. She didn't answer that, not in words, but she didn't argue further either. And when Caleb left that night, She stood on the porch a long while after his horse had disappeared down the road, watching the dark where he'd gone, with an expression that carried equal parts hope and dread, as though she already knew somewhere beneath the fragile comfort of these past weeks that the quiet whispers building around them were only the first low rumble of a storm that hadn't yet decided how hard it meant to break. It broke 3 days later at Sunday service in front of the whole congregation. Evelyn had debated not going at all, had stood in front of her one good dress for the better part of an hour, arguing with herself about whether attending church was worth the stares she knew were waiting. But in the end, stubbornness won out over dread, same as it usually did with her. She would not. She told herself, let a handful of small-minded neighbors chase her out of a church she'd worshipped in for 15 years. She should have listened to the dread. The whispers started the moment she walked through the door, quick and quiet, the kind meant to be heard without ever being loud enough to answer directly. She took her seat toward the back alone and felt every head in the pews ahead of her turn just slightly, just long enough to look and look away all through the opening hymn. It was during the closing prayer, when the congregation stood with heads bowed, that Margaret Langford's voice cut through the silence, not loud, not shouted, but pitched with the precise, deliberate clarity of a woman who wanted to be heard by everyone, while appearing to speak to no one in particular. It's a shame, Margaret said to the woman beside her, though her eyes cut sideways toward the back pew where Evelyn stood frozen. How quickly some folks forget their manners once a man's alone and vulnerable. My daughter's barely cold in her grave 3 years, and already there's talk of another woman making herself comfortable in her husband's affections. Some people simply have no shame. The prayer ended. The silence that followed was worse than any words could have been. Evelyn stood very still, her spine straight, her hands folded tight enough that her knuckles had gone white, while every eye in the church found some reason to drift toward her and away again, quick ashamed, unwilling to meet her gaze directly, but unwilling to look away entirely either. She did not cry. She would not give Margaret Langford or any of them the satisfaction of that. She simply turned, walked the length of the aisle with her chin level and her steps unhurried, and stepped out into the harsh brightness of a Sunday morning that had, in the space of a single sentence, made very clear exactly how far the town's patience for her had already worn thin. By the time word reached Caleb, it had traveled and twisted the way gossip in a small town always does, gaining sharper edges with every retelling until the version that finally reached him from a ranch hand who'd heard it from his sister who'd been sitting 3 pews back had Margaret Langford practically accusing Evelyn of chasing him down at the creek that first morning, on purpose of manufacturing the whole business with the Colt, to worm her way into a grieving widower's good graces. Caleb was in his saddle and riding for Evelyn's cabin before the hand had finished the telling. He found her in the yard, not crying exactly, but standing very still beside the fence he'd mended weeks before, one hand resting on the rail, like she needed something solid to hold on to, watching Ember graze in the late afternoon light, with an expression that gave away nothing and everything at once. "I heard," Caleb said, swinging down from his horse before it had fully stopped. "Word travels fast in this county. Faster than good sense most days." "Evelyn." "I'm fine, Caleb." But her voice shook faint on the last word, betraying the lie even as she said it. "You're not fine. She humiliated you in front of the whole church. She's grieving." Evelyn's knuckles went whiter still against the fence rail. "Margaret lost her only daughter. I understand grief better than most, Caleb. God knows I've drowned in it myself these 5 years. I don't blame her for hating the sight of me. I blame myself for thinking even for one foolish minute that I could sit in that church like I belonged there, without the whole town deciding I'd stolen something that wasn't mine to take. You haven't stolen anything. I'm not a possession that belonged to Margaret Langford's grief. I get to decide who I spend my mornings with, same as any man in this territory. Do you—" Evelyn turned to face him finally, and the look in her eyes stopped him cold. Not anger, not quite despair, but something exhausted and afraid that he hadn't seen in her before, not even in the darkest hour of Ember's fight for breath. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like this whole town has already decided otherwise, and I've seen what a town united against a woman can do to her life, piece by piece, until there's nothing left worth calling a life at all. Nobody is going to run you out of your own home." Nobody has to run me out with a gun and a torch, Caleb. All they have to do is close every door, cancel every arrangement, turn every head away until I can't buy eggs or thread, or a moment's kindness anywhere in this county without traveling 3 towns over to find it. That's how it's done out here. Quiet, patient. And it works every time because a woman alone can't fight 100 small refusals all stacked up together. Caleb had no answer for that, because some part of him, the part that had grown up in this territory, that had watched other families quietly frozen out over lesser scandals than a widow and widower spending their mornings together, knew she wasn't wrong. "Then I'll stand beside you," he said finally. "Every closed door, I'll be standing right there beside you when it shuts. And how long before your own doors start closing too? How long before Margaret decides it isn't enough to punish me and starts working on your credit at the bank? You're standing with the men who buy your cattle, your own place in this town you've lived in your whole life." Evelyn shook her head slow, something breaking behind her eyes, even as her voice stayed steady. "I won't be the reason you lose everything you've spent your whole life building, Caleb. I've lost too much myself to watch it happen to someone else because of me. That's not your decision to make alone, isn't it?" She looked at him, and for just a moment, something in her face closed off entirely, shuttered tight against him in a way it hadn't been in weeks. "I think more than anything else in this world right now, it's exactly my decision to make." She didn't say anything more that evening. She let him stay for supper, let him check on Ember one last time before he rode home in the dark. Let the silence between them settle into something that felt for the first time since that morning at the creek, less like comfort and more like the quiet before a door closing. Caleb rode home with an unease he couldn't name, sitting heavy in his chest. Some instinct screaming beneath the surface of his thoughts that the woman he'd left standing by that fence rail had just made a decision. She hadn't told him about a decision built from the same fierce, stubborn love for the people around her that had sent her running barefoot down a creek bank weeks before to save a colt everyone else had already given up on. He told himself he was imagining it, told himself sleep would settle his nerves, and morning would bring things back to their steady rhythm, coffee on the porch, and Ember stumbling across the yard, and Evelyn's easy laugh carrying across the fence line, same as it had every morning for weeks now. He did not yet understand that the woman who refused to let a colt be buried before its final breath was the same woman who would rather disappear into the dark alone than watch the people she loved pay the price for loving her back. Morning came gray and slow, and Caleb woke before dawn with the same uneasy weight sitting on his chest that had followed him home the night before. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a man could ride out first thing, share coffee watch. Ember stretch his legs across the yard and find that all his worry had been nothing more than a tired mind borrowing trouble that didn't belong to it. He was wrong, and some part of him had known it the whole ride over. The cabin sat silent when he arrived. No smoke rising from the chimney, no lantern glow behind the window, despite the hour still being dark enough to want one. Caleb's horse hadn't even come to a full stop before he was out of the saddle boots hitting the dirt, hard, his heart already climbing into his throat. "Evelyn." No answer. He pushed through this door without knocking. Something he'd never done before, not once in all the weeks he'd been coming here, but his hands moved faster than his manners that morning. The cabin was empty. Not ransacked, not disturbed, just empty in the particular deliberate way a room looks when someone has left it on purpose, taking only what mattered and leaving the rest exactly as it was. The coffee tin sat untouched on the shelf. The quilt Evelyn had wrapped around Ember that first desperate morning was folded neat as a held breath at the foot of the cold stove. And on the small table by the window, weighted down with a stone from the creek bank, was a single folded sheet of paper with his name written across the front in Evelyn's careful hand. Caleb's fingers weren't steady when he picked it up. "Caleb, by the time you read this, I'll be well past the ridge. Don't come looking for me. Not because I don't want you to, but because I need you to understand why I couldn't stay and let you talk me out of this. I've watched what a town like ours does to people it decides to punish, and I won't watch it happen to you because of me. Margaret Langford has more influence in this county than either of us wants to admit. And I know Caleb. The way I knew Ember's heart was still beating when everyone else had already given up on him. That if I stay, she won't stop with closed doors and canceled orders. She'll come for your credit at the bank. She'll come for your standing with the cattle buyers. She'll come for everything you've spent 3 hard years rebuilding since Sarah passed, and she'll do it patient and quiet the way these things are always done until there's nothing left of your good name for her to take. I won't be the reason for that. I've lost too much in my life to sit still and watch you lose everything because you were kind enough to fall in love with a widow. This town decided wasn't worth protecting. Ember is strong now. Strong enough to weather most anything, same as you taught him to be, same as you'll keep teaching him, even without me there to fuss over him. Love him the way you've loved him since the day you refused to let me talk you into believing he was already gone. That's the only thing I'm asking of you. Please don't follow me. Please let this be the one time you let me protect something instead of the other way around. Evelyn. Caleb read it twice before the words fully landed. And when they did, something in his chest cracked wide open in a way it hadn't since the morning 3 years ago when a doctor had told him there was nothing more to be done for Sarah. No, he said out loud to an empty cabin that gave no answer back. No, you don't get to do this. He was moving before he'd finished the thought out the door back into the saddle. His horse startled into a hard gallop by the sudden violence of his hands on the reins. Ember penned in the small stall Caleb had built weeks before, whinnied high and frantic at the commotion. But Caleb didn't slow, didn't look back. His whole mind narrowed down to one single desperate certainty: Evelyn Harper had run before twice from foals she couldn't save. She was not going to run from this without a fight from him too. The trouble was, he had no idea where to look. He rode first to the widow's nearest neighbor, old Sarah Beaumont, not for any relation to his late wife. Just an unfortunate shared name that Caleb had never once let himself dwell on until this exact moment. Riding hard toward her gate, with his heart hammering, and found the old woman on her porch already awake, already watching the road like she'd been expecting company. "She's not here," Sarah Beaumont said before Caleb had even swung down from his horse. "You know where she's gone. I know she came through before first light with a single bag and asked me not to say a word to anyone who came asking." The old woman's eyes were sharp, despite her years studying Caleb with an assessment he couldn't quite read. "I told her I wouldn't lie for her, but I also wouldn't chase down the road shouting her business to the wind. Whether I tell you or not, Caleb Walker is a decision I haven't made up my mind about yet. Mrs. Beaumont, please, you love her." It wasn't a question. Truly love her, or are you just chasing after the comfort she gave you these past weeks because it's easier than sitting alone with your grief? The question hit him harder than he expected, hard enough that he had to take a breath before he answered it, because he understood standing there in the gray light of a morning that had already gone wrong in every way it could, that the old woman deserved an honest answer and not a hasty one. "I buried my wife 3 years ago," Caleb said slowly, "and told myself I was done feeling anything worth losing again. Evelyn Harper walked into my life screaming down a creek bank about a heartbeat nobody else could find, and in 5 weeks she's given me back more of myself than I thought I had left to find. That's not comfort, Mrs. Beaumont. That's not convenience. That's a woman who taught me how to hope again when I'd sworn off hoping for good, and I will not let her disappear into this county thinking she's doing me some kind of favor by breaking both our hearts alone." Sarah Beaumont studied him a long moment more, then nodded once sharp and final. "She's staying with my sister Ruth Calloway, 2 valleys over past the old mill road. Left before dawn on foot, said she'd walk the whole way if she had to, though I expect she found someone willing to carry her part of it." The old woman's mouth pressed thin. "She cried the whole time she was packing that bag, Caleb, though she'd have skinned me alive for telling you that. Whatever you mean to say to her, I'd think hard on saying it right, because that woman does not run from things easily. Whatever chased her out of her own home this morning, it chased her hard. Margaret Langford." Caleb said the name coming out of him like a curse. "Ah." Sarah Beaumont's face tightened with an understanding that told Caleb this was not news to her at all. "That woman's grief has teeth, and she's not particular about who she bites with them. You'd best ride fast if you mean to catch Evelyn before her nerve about leaving turns into stubbornness about staying gone." Caleb didn't wait to hear more. He was back in the saddle and turning his horse toward the mill road before Sarah Beaumont had finished speaking, riding hard through country he knew only well enough to be dangerous at speed. His mind consumed entirely with the image of Evelyn walking alone in the dark, believing herself to be doing something noble, when all she was really doing was breaking something neither of them had finished building. But even as he rode, another current was building behind him in town, one he wouldn't learn about until later that day, one that would prove Evelyn's fears about Margaret Langford's reach had been if anything understated. Margaret Langford woke that same morning to news of Evelyn's disappearance carried to her by a hired girl who'd heard it from the Beaumont place, and something in her chest that had been coiled tight with grief and fury for weeks finally uncoiled into something colder and far more dangerous satisfaction. Gone. Margaret repeated, turning the word over like she was tasting something long denied to her. Gone where? Nobody rightly knows, ma'am. Just gone before first light, they say. Left a note for Mr. Walker. Margaret's hands folded neat in her lap, tightened until her knuckles went pale. She had spent 5 years since her daughter's death, nursing a grief that had curdled slowly into something she no longer fully recognized in herself. A bitterness that had found in Evelyn Harper's growing closeness with Caleb, a target sharp enough to focus all that scattered pain into something with purpose. She told herself, as she had told herself every day for weeks, that she was protecting Sarah's memory. She told herself the widow Harper had no right stepping into a life that still belonged in every way that mattered to Margaret, to her daughter. She did not examine too closely why the thought of Evelyn Harper gone from the county for good sent something almost like triumph humming beneath her ribs. Send word to the bank, Margaret said to the hired girl. I want to speak with Mr. Prescott this afternoon. And send word to Aaron Fenwick as well. I believe he handles Mr. Walker's cattle contracts, does he not? I believe so, ma'am, but that will be all. The hired girl left with the distinct sense that she had just witnessed something set into motion that she did not fully understand and did not much want to. She was not wrong to feel it. By noon, word had reached the bank that Margaret Langford, whose late husband's family held no small influence over half the credit extended in that county. A fact everyone in town understood, even if they rarely spoke it aloud, had expressed some concern about Caleb Walker's recent judgment. His frequent absences from his own ranch, the state of neglect she'd heard tell his herd had fallen into while he spent his mornings elsewhere. Nothing was said outright. Nothing needed to be. A word dropped here, a raised eyebrow there. And by the time Aaron Fenwick sat down to review the terms of the cattle contract he'd held with the Walker Ranch for 6 years running, he found himself without quite understanding why hesitating over numbers he'd never hesitated over before. This was the quiet, patient violence Evelyn had tried to warn him about, and it was already moving through the county like water finding cracks in a dam long before Caleb ever caught sight of the Calloway homestead rising up out of the morning haze 2 valleys over. He found Evelyn in the yard of all places, hanging wash on a line strung between 2 fence posts, her sleeves rolled and her face set, with the particular grim determination of a woman trying very hard to convince herself that ordinary work could fill the hollow place a decision like hers had carved out. She saw him coming before he'd fully reined in, and the wooden pin fell from her fingers. You shouldn't have followed me. I wasn't about to let you walk out of my life over a letter and a stone paperweight, Evelyn Harper. Caleb swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground harder than he meant them to, his chest heaving from the ride. Not after everything. Not without a fight. This isn't a fight you can win, Caleb. It's not even a fight you should be fighting. This is me trying to protect the one good thing left standing in your life before Margaret Langford burns it to the ground out of spite. You don't get to decide that for me. Somebody has to, since you clearly weren't going to. Evelyn. No. Her voice cracked sharp and sudden, and Caleb saw for the first time since he'd known her real tears standing bright in her eyes, without any effort made to hide them. No. You don't get to ride in here and tell me I'm wrong about this Caleb Walker, not when I've already lost a husband to fever and 2 foals to the cold, and I know better than anyone exactly what it costs to keep loving something the world seems determined to take from you. I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because I love you too much to watch you lose your ranch, your reputation, your whole life's work, because you couldn't bring yourself to let me walk away, when walking away was the only thing that could save it." The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, Caleb simply stood there, letting them land, letting the full weight of what she'd just admitted settle into his chest alongside the ache that had been building there since he'd found her cabin empty at dawn. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Say what again?" "The part where you said you love me." Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed, color rising fast and furious in her cheeks. That isn't the point of what I just said, Caleb. It's the only part of what you just said that matters to me." He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, close enough now that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze close enough that he could see her pulse jumping fast at her throat. "You love me. And instead of telling me that instead of standing beside me and letting me decide for myself what I'm willing to risk, for that you decided the kindest thing you could do was disappear before dawn and leave me a note like I was a stranger you were settling accounts with. I was trying to protect you. I don't need protecting from loving you, Evelyn. I need you to stop deciding what I can and can't survive. I buried a wife. I buried 3 years of hoping for anything at all. I have survived worse than a town full of gossips and one grieving woman with a grudge, and I would rather survive all of it standing beside you than spend one more day of my life pretending I don't feel what I feel because it might cost me something." Evelyn's composure, held together by sheer stubborn will since the moment she'd walked out of her cabin before dawn, finally broke entirely. She pressed both hands to her face, her shoulders shaking, and Caleb closed the last of the distance between them and folded her into his arms without asking permission, the way he hadn't held another living soul since the day they lowered Sarah into the ground. "I was so scared," Evelyn said into his shirt, muffled and raw. "I was so scared of watching you lose everything because of me. And I thought if I left before you could talk me out of it, it wouldn't hurt as much. I was wrong. It hurts worse. It hurts so much worse. Caleb, walking away from you hurt worse than anything Margaret Langford could ever do to me." "Then don't do it again." "I won't. I swear to you I won't." She pulled back just far enough to look up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and fierce all at once. "But you have to understand what we're walking back into. Margaret isn't finished. A woman like that with grief this deep and influence this wide, she won't stop just because I've come home. If anything, my leaving and coming back again will only give her more to talk about. Then let her talk." Caleb's jaw set hard, something new and unshakable settling into his voice. "I'm done letting other people decide how I'm allowed to live my own life, Evelyn. Sarah's been gone 3 years, and I spent every one of those years letting grief and this town's expectations tell me what a proper morning man was supposed to look like. You taught me that. Colt out there taught me that sometimes the thing everyone's already decided is finished still has fight left in it if somebody's willing to stand there and refuse to give up. I am not giving up on this, on us, whatever it costs." Evelyn stared up at him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of doubt, and found none. "All right," she said finally, quiet but steady. "All right, Caleb, I'll come home. But we do this together side by side, and if Margaret Langford wants a fight, then God help her, she's going to get one from both of us. That's the woman who ran down a creek bank barefoot to save a dying colt nobody else believed in." Caleb said something almost like a smile breaking through the tension in his face. "I was wondering when she'd come back. She never left. She was just scared for a few hours." Evelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, drew a long, steadying breath, and looked toward the Calloway house, where Ruth stood watching the whole reunion from the doorway with poorly disguised curiosity. "Let me gather my things. And Caleb, thank you for coming after me. Nobody's ever come after me before?" "Get used to it," he said. "I don't intend to stop." The ride back was slower than the ride out had been unhurried, despite everything waiting for them in town. Evelyn's horse borrowed from Ruth Calloway, with a promise to return it soon, walking easy alongside Caleb's, their hands finding each other more than once across the space between their saddles. But peace, they both understood without needing to say it aloud, was not something the county was prepared to hand them freely. Word of Evelyn's flight and Caleb's pursuit had already begun its own crooked journey through the gossip lines that ran faster than any horse, and by the time they reached the outskirts of town, the story had already twisted itself into something uglier than the truth. A version where Evelyn had run not from fear of harming Caleb, but from guilt from scandal, from something shameful she didn't want the town to see. They rode straight past their own homes and into the heart of town, toward the general store, because Caleb had decided somewhere on that long ride back that half measures and quiet living had cost them enough already. If the town wanted to talk, then it could talk with both of them standing right there in front of it, refusing to hide. The bell above the store door rang loud in the sudden hush that fell as they stepped inside. Hiram Doyle looked up from his ledger. His expression caught somewhere between alarm and relief. Mrs. Fenwick stood near the fabric bolts again, as though she'd never left her mouth already opening with some fresh piece of commentary that died the moment she saw the set of Caleb's jaw. "Afternoon," Caleb said, his voice carrying clean and even through the whole room. "I expect most of you have heard some version of what happened this morning, and I expect most of what you heard isn't the truth of it. So, I'll tell you plain, since apparently plain speaking is in short supply in this town lately." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Evelyn Harper left before dawn this morning because she was trying to protect me from exactly the kind of talk that's been circling this county for weeks: the canceled orders, the closed doors, the Sunday morning humiliation. Some of you stood by and watched happen without a single word raised in her defense. She thought leaving would spare me the cost of loving her. I rode 2 valleys to bring her home because I refuse to let this town decide who I'm allowed to care for. Same as I refuse to let it decide when my grief for my late wife is officially over and done with, as though sorrow works on anybody's schedule but its own. Evelyn stood beside him, her chin level, her hand finding his without hesitation, this time in full view of every eye in the store. "Evelyn Harper's credit is good with me," Caleb continued. "Same as her word, same as her honor. And any man or woman in this county who's got a problem extending her the same courtesy they'd extend any other widow in good standing can bring that problem directly to me instead of whispering it behind her back." The bell above the door rang again, and every head turned as Margaret Langford stepped into the sudden silence, her expression flickering through surprise. Then something harder and more brittle as she took in the sight of Caleb and Evelyn standing together, unashamed in the middle of the general store. "Caleb," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled, "I'd heard you rode out this morning in quite a hurry. I'm glad to see you've returned safely." "I have, and I've brought Evelyn home with me where she belongs." Something flickered across Margaret's face, grief perhaps, or the particular fury of a woman watching a carefully built campaign begin to crumble in front of an audience she'd spent weeks cultivating. "I only meant to protect Sarah's memory," she said, and her voice for the first time since Caleb had known her these past 3 years wavered. "Is that so unforgivable a thing for a mother to want?" "No," Caleb said, gentler now, though no less firm. "It's not unforgivable to grieve Margaret. God knows I understand that better than most. But grief doesn't give you the right to destroy an innocent woman's life, just because her presence reminds you that the world kept turning after Sarah died. Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. She was the kindest woman I ever knew, and she'd have been the first person in this store to stand beside Evelyn, not the last." The store had gone utterly silent, every customer and clerk holding their breath, watching Margaret Langford's face work through something that looked for the first time in 5 years less like anger and more like the raw grief beneath it that had never truly been allowed to heal. "I only wanted—" Margaret started, then stopped, her composure cracking visibly now. "I only wanted something of her to remain unchanged. As long as you stayed alone, Caleb, some part of me could pretend Sarah was still, that her place in your life hadn't been—" She couldn't finish it. Her hand came up to cover her mouth, and for a moment, the woman who had spent weeks quietly dismantling Evelyn Harper's standing in this town looked instead like exactly what she was: a mother who had never been given the space to properly grieve her only daughter, who had built a wall of bitterness because the alternative was facing a loss too large to hold any other way. Evelyn, to Caleb's quiet astonishment, stepped forward. "Mrs. Langford," she said, her voice steady, despite everything the woman had put her through. "I never wanted to replace your daughter. I couldn't, even if I tried. Nobody could replace what she was to Caleb or to you. I only wanted to be seen for who I actually am. A woman who kept her promises. A woman who saved a life when everyone else had already decided it wasn't worth saving. That's all I've ever asked of this town, and it's all I'm asking of you." Margaret stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes before she gave a single small nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had stood 5 years unbroken. "The Colt," Margaret said finally, her voice thin. "The one you saved. Is he well?" "He's thriving," Evelyn said. "Stronger every day." "Sarah loved that mare," Margaret whispered half to herself. "She'd have wanted her line to survive. She'd have wanted—" Her voice broke entirely, and she turned and left the store without finishing the sentence, the bell ringing sharp and lonely behind her. The silence that followed her departure held a different quality than the one before it. Not the tense, judgmental quiet of a town waiting to see which way to lean, but something more uncertain, more thoughtful. As though every person in that store had just witnessed something they hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to file away. Hiram Doyle was the first to move, clearing his throat and reaching for his ledger like the whole scene hadn't just unfolded in front of him. "Mrs. Harper," he said a little too formally, "I believe we still owe you an apology for the trouble with your thread order. If you'd like to settle that today, I'd be glad to see it corrected." It wasn't much. It wasn't everything. But it was a beginning, and Evelyn's hand tightened around Caleb's as she felt for the first time in weeks the faintest loosening of the noose that had been closing slow and patient around her life since the morning gossip first started tracking Caleb's horse to her cabin door. They didn't linger in town long after that. There was still Ember waiting. Still a Colt who had spent the whole day fretting in his stall over the sudden absence of both the people who'd fought so hard to keep him alive. But as they rode home together in the fading light, something had shifted between them and the world around them that neither fully understood yet only felt the way a person feels, a storm break before the rain actually falls. The gossip did not vanish overnight. The whispered judgments, the sideways glances, the small cruelties dressed up as concern. Those things had roots too deep in a town like theirs to be undone by a single confrontation in a general store, however dramatic. But something had cracked, and cracks Evelyn knew from long experience with dying things and stubborn hope alike had a way of letting light in eventually. Ember greeted them at the fence with a whinny loud enough to wake the whole valley, shoving his nose hard into Evelyn's palm the moment she was close enough to reach, as though scolding her personally for the day's absence. "I know," Evelyn murmured, pressing her forehead against his warm neck. "I know I'm sorry. I won't do that again. Neither of us will," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding the small of her back with an ease that felt, despite everything the day had cost them, entirely natural. "Whatever comes next, Margaret, the town, all of it, we face it together from here on." "Together," Evelyn repeated, testing the shape of the word, the same way he'd once tested the shape of her name. "I could get used to that." "Good, because I intend to make sure you do." Behind them, the last light of evening spilled gold and quiet across the ridge, and Ember, sensing perhaps that the worst of the danger had passed for now, folded his legs beneath him in the grass and settled down to rest between the two people who had refused, each in their own stubborn way, to let anything be buried before its time. The morning after the general store confrontation, Caleb woke before the sun, same as always, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, the weight in his chest wasn't grief. It was something closer to purpose, sharp and clean, and he lay there a moment, just letting himself feel the difference before he rose to dress. He rode to Evelyn's cabin expecting to find the same fragile quiet they'd left behind the evening before. What he found instead was Evelyn already up, already dressed, standing at her kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of her that had nothing to do with Colts or coffee or anything domestic at all. "You're up early," he said, stepping through the door she'd left propped for him. "Couldn't sleep." She didn't look up from the papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Kept thinking about what Margaret said yesterday, about Sarah's mare's line surviving." "What are you doing?" "Going through my father's old breeding records. He kept ledgers on every mare and sire he ever worked with going back 30 years. I copied out what I could remember of them before I left Kentucky, in case I ever needed them again. She finally looked up, and there was something bright and urgent in her face that Caleb hadn't seen since the earliest days of Ember's fight for life. "Caleb, I think I know why Ember came so close to dying, and I think I know how to keep it from happening again if Sarah's mare ever foals a second time. She's too old to foal again, we both know that. I'm not talking about the mare." Evelyn tapped one of the pages, her finger landing on a column of cramped, careful handwriting. "I'm talking about the whole line. Your late wife's family bred that stock, didn't they? Before the drought thinned the herd." Sarah's father. Yes. Before he passed, before the drought took most of what he'd built. Then somewhere in this county, or the next one over there, maybe other horses carrying that same blood cousins to Ember's damn animals nobody's thought to look at twice because they don't know what they're looking at. Evelyn's eyes were bright with an energy Caleb hadn't seen unleashed on anything but Ember's care before now. "If we could find even one or two breed them properly, with the kind of care my father used to swear by, instead of just letting nature take its chances the way most ranchers around here do." "You're talking about rebuilding my herd from nothing." "I'm talking about rebuilding your herd from something. From blood that already proved with Ember that it's stronger than anybody gave it credit for." She looked at him, something almost shy creeping into her certainty. "If you'd want that. It's your ranch, Caleb, your decision. I've no right sitting here making plans for land that isn't mine." Caleb crossed the room, slow, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down to look properly at the pages spread before them. Column after column of breeding notes, foaling dates, bloodlines traced with the patient precision of a man who'd spent his whole life understanding horses in a way most ranchers never bothered to learn. "Your father taught you all this." "Every bit of it. Sunday afternoons mostly, while my mother thought I was at needlework." A small private smile touched her mouth. "I was terrible at needlework. Still am if you want the truth of it. But I could read a bloodline by the time I was 12 years old and tell you which mare would throw a stronger foal than her sister 3 farms over. Then teach me." Caleb said it simply without hesitation and watched surprise flicker across Evelyn's face. "I've run cattle my whole life because that's what my father ran before me, and horses because Sarah loved them. But I never learned the half of what you're talking about. If we're going to do this rebuild something worth having out of what's left of my herd, I want to actually understand it, not just stand around holding fence posts while you do the real work." "You already do plenty of real work, Caleb Walker." "Not this kind. This is your gift, same as saving that colt was your gift. I'd be a fool not to want to learn from it." Something in Evelyn's face softened at that gratitude, and something warmer moving behind her eyes, and for a moment, the two of them simply sat there, over a table full of old ledger pages, closer than they'd been in the aftermath of the previous day's storm building, toward something neither of them had quite named out loud yet, but both of them could feel taking shape. It was Ember who interrupted, as he so often did, with an indignant whinny from the yard, demanding his morning feed, and the moment broke into the easy laughter that had become as natural to them as breathing. "Duty calls," Evelyn said, rising. "Duty can wait 5 more minutes. Duty," she said, arching a brow at him, "has 4 legs and absolutely no patience, and if you think otherwise, you clearly haven't been on the receiving end of his complaints at 5 in the morning when I'm running behind." They went out together, and the morning unfolded the way so many mornings had before the whole business with Margaret and the town had come to its head. Feed measured water, checked Ember racing the length of the yard on legs grown strong and sure over the past weeks, showing off Evelyn swore purely for the benefit of an audience he knew was watching. But the world outside their small circle of fence and cabin had not stood still overnight, and it was mid-morning when the first sign of what waited beyond it arrived in the shape of a rider Caleb recognized from half a mile off Thomas Ridley, who ran the feed store and had never in 6 years ridden all the way out to Caleb's own ranch, let alone Evelyn's, for anything short of urgent business. "Caleb." Ridley called, reining up at the fence, his hat pushed back, and sweat already darkening his collar despite the early hour. "Glad I caught you here. Been by your place twice already this morning looking for you. What's the trouble?" Aaron Fenwick sent word he wants to meet about the cattle contract. Today, if you can manage it. Something about needing to revise the terms before the fall shipment. Ridley's expression carried an apology he didn't quite know how to voice. I don't like the sound of it myself, Caleb, and neither did Fenwick when I pressed him on it, but he said the request came down from higher than him. From Margaret. Ridley didn't answer that directly, which was answer enough. Contract's been steady 6 years running. This is the first I've heard of any trouble with it. Caleb's jaw tightened, the easy warmth of the morning souring fast into something harder. Beside him, Evelyn had gone very still, her hand finding the fence rail the way it had the day the gossip first reached her about canceled thread orders and returned preserving pots. "I'll ride in this afternoon," Caleb said. "Thank you for the warning, Ridley. Wish I had better news to carry." The man tipped his hat, wheeled his horse, and was gone back down the road, leaving a silence behind him that neither Caleb nor Evelyn rushed to fill. "She's not finished," Evelyn said finally, quiet and grim. "I told you, Caleb. A woman like Margaret doesn't let go of a fight just because she cried in front of a store full of people. If anything, that'll only make her angrier at herself for showing weakness, and angrier at us for being the reason she had to. Then I'll go handle it. We'll go handle it." Evelyn's chin lifted stubborn and sure. "I told you yesterday, Caleb Walker. Together. That means when trouble comes knocking, it finds both of us standing at the door, not just you carrying it alone, while I wait here wringing my hands over ledger pages." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded, something like pride moving through the worry in his chest. "All right, together then." They rode into town that afternoon side by side, and if either of them expected a repeat of the tense whispering silence that had greeted them the day before, the reality proved more complicated than that some faces still turned away as they passed, but others surprisingly offered small nods. Careful greetings. The first tentative signs of a town beginning to reconsider a story it had accepted too quickly. Aaron Fenwick's office sat above the feed store, a cramped room smelling of tobacco and old ledgers, and the man himself looked distinctly uncomfortable when Caleb and Evelyn walked in together, clearly not having anticipated the widow's presence at what he'd likely hoped would be a quiet, one-sided conversation. "Caleb," Fenwick said, half rising from behind his desk. "Mrs. Harper, I wasn't expecting. You wanted to discuss revising my cattle contract," Caleb said, cutting straight through the pleasantries, taking the chair across from Fenwick's desk without waiting to be invited to sit. "I'd like to hear the reasoning plain and direct if you don't mind." Fenwick shifted, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "It's nothing personal, Caleb, you understand. Business is business, and there have been some concerns raised about the current state of your herd, given the drought these past years, and the attention your affairs have drawn lately." "My affairs?" "Your time, Caleb. Folks have noticed you've been spending less of it on your own ranch, and more of it." Fenwick's eyes flicked apologetic toward Evelyn. "Elsewhere. There's concern the herd's condition might not support the terms we'd originally agreed on. Have you seen my herd, Mr. Fenwick?" Caleb's voice stayed level, but there was an edge beneath it now, sharp as a blade held loose and ready. "Ridden out to check the condition of my cattle yourself before deciding their worth had changed?" "Well, no, not personally, but then I'd ask you not to revise terms on my herd's condition based on gossip about how I spend my mornings, and instead ride out and see the actual cattle for yourself before we discuss changing anything at all." Caleb leaned forward slightly. "I built that herd back up from nearly nothing after the drought took half of what my father left me. I've missed no payment defaulted on no obligation and given you no cause in 6 years to doubt my word. I'd like to know whose cause you're actually serving here, Mr. Fenwick, mine or Margaret Langford's." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Fenwick's face had gone a mottled shade of red, caught between the truth he couldn't quite deny and the pressure he clearly didn't have the spine to resist outright. "I never said, Mrs. Langford, you didn't need to." Evelyn spoke for the first time since entering the office, her voice calm, but carrying an authority that made Fenwick's eyes snap to her despite himself. "Mr. Fenwick, might I ask you something plainly, since we're already speaking plainly today?" Yes, ma'am, of course." In the 6 years you've held this contract with Mr. Walker, has he ever once given you cause to question his honesty, his reliability, or the quality of his cattle? No, ma'am. Never. And in that same time, has anything about his herd, his land, or his standing in this community actually changed, apart from the fact that he's found some measure of happiness after 3 years of grieving his wife alone? Fenwick's throat worked, his gaze dropping to the papers on his desk, rather than meet either of their eyes directly. No, ma'am, nothing's changed but that. Then I'd think very carefully, Mr. Fenwick, about whose judgment you're trusting over your own eyes, and 6 years of honest business between you and Mr. Walker. Because the day may come when this county remembers exactly who stood firm on principle, and who let their spine bend to whichever voice shouted loudest and carried the most money behind it. Fenwick sat very still for a long moment, the weight of the room pressing down on him, before he finally exhaled and reached for his ledger. The terms stand as they were, he said quietly. I apologize for the trouble, Caleb, truly. I should have ridden out and looked for myself before letting anyone else's concerns get ahead of my own judgment. I appreciate you saying so. Caleb rose, extending his hand, and Fenwick shook it with the particular relief of a man grateful to be let off a hook he'd never wanted to be caught on in the first place. We'll speak again, come fall shipment, same as always. They left the office together, and it wasn't until they were back on the street, back in their saddles, and riding clear of the town's watching eyes, that Evelyn finally let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding the whole meeting through. That was well done, Caleb said. That was terrifying. Evelyn admitted, a shaky laugh escaping her. I've never spoken to a man like that in my life. My mother would have fainted dead away. Your mother clearly never watched you talk a stranger out of burying a colt at dawn. That's different. That was Ember's life on the line. This was your life on the line, too, Caleb said, more serious now. Yours and mine both. You fought for it same as you fought for him. I won't forget that. Evelyn didn't answer right away, but the look she gave him carried more than words might have. And they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that felt for the first time in days genuinely peaceful, rather than merely a held breath waiting for the next blow to land. But peace, as they were both learning, came in fragments in a county still working through the last of its gossip and grudges. And the fragment they'd earned that afternoon didn't last through the week. It was 4 days later, on a morning that had started ordinary enough coffee on Evelyn's porch. Ember racing figure eights around the yard, with an energy that made them both laugh, despite the tension still humming beneath the surface of their days, that Margaret Langford appeared at the fence line alone without warning, her carriage left waiting on the road behind her. Evelyn saw her first and went very still, her cup halfway to her lips. Caleb, she said quietly. He followed her gaze and set his own cup down, slow rising from the porch step with a wariness that mirrored hers. Margaret, I'm not here to cause trouble. Margaret's voice, when it came, sounded smaller than Caleb had ever heard it. None of the sharp, controlled cruelty of the church pew, none of the cold satisfaction he imagined must have accompanied her visit to the bank and the cattle contract. Just tired, worn thin in a way that made her look for the first time since Sarah's death genuinely old. I've come to see the colt, if that would be permitted. Evelyn and Caleb exchanged a glance, some unspoken negotiation passing between them, before Evelyn nodded slow. He's in the yard. You're welcome to see him. Margaret walked forward slowly, her hands folded tight in front of her, her eyes fixed on the young black horse now trotting curious circles a good distance away, testing the stranger's intentions with the wary intelligence of an animal who'd learned early that not everyone in the world meant him well. He has her marking, Margaret said softly, almost to herself. That whirl between the eyes. Sarah's mare had the very same one. I'd forgotten until just now. Would you like to see him closer? Evelyn asked, gentler than Caleb had expected, given everything the woman standing before them had put her through these past weeks. Margaret hesitated, then nodded, and Evelyn led her slow toward the fence, calling Ember with the same low, patient murmur she'd used since that first desperate morning by the stove. The colt approached with careful curiosity, nose extended, and when Margaret reached out a trembling hand to touch him, something in her whole body seemed to loosen at once. Sarah would have loved him, Margaret whispered, her composure finally cracking entirely, tears spilling silent down her face as Ember leaned into her palm the same trusting way he leaned into everyone who'd earned it. She loved that mare so dearly. I remember she used to sneak out at dawn just to sit in the paddock with her before her chores. I scolded her for it every time, and she never once stopped doing it. She sounds like she had a good heart, Evelyn said quietly. She did. The best heart of anyone I ever knew. Margaret wiped her face with the back of her glove composure, warring visibly with grief, still raw after 5 years of being nursed instead of released. I think some part of me believed that if I could just keep everything the same, keep Caleb alone, keep her memory, the only thing occupying the space she left behind, then I hadn't really lost her. As though grief could be managed, controlled, kept from spreading further than it already had. She looked up, meeting Evelyn's eyes directly for the first time since arriving. I was wrong to take that fear out on you, Mrs. Harper. Wrong to let it turn into cruelty when you'd done nothing but save a life everyone else had given up on, same as Sarah would have wanted someone to do. Mrs. Langford. Margaret, please. The older woman's voice wavered. I don't deserve your kindness after what I've done these past weeks, but I would be grateful for it all the same if you found it in yourself to offer it. Evelyn glanced at Caleb, some silent question passing between them, before she reached out and gently took Margaret's hand. I understand grief that doesn't know how to let go, Margaret. I buried a husband myself 5 years now, and there were nights I thought holding on to my anger about it was the only thing keeping me upright at all. It isn't easy learning that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but I think Sarah would want you to try. For your own sake, if nothing else. Margaret's tears came harder then, and Evelyn, without hesitation, pulled the older woman into an embrace that Caleb watched with something tight and unexpected rising in his own throat. Two women who had every reason to remain enemies, choosing instead in the quiet of an ordinary morning to lay down a burden neither of them could carry alone any longer. I spoke with Aaron Fenwick, Margaret said, finally pulling back, wiping her face with hands that shook only slightly now. And with Mr. Prescott at the bank. I told them both I'd been wrong to raise concerns that had nothing to do with actual business, and everything to do with grief I hadn't properly worked through. I don't know if it undoes all the damage. I know it doesn't undo the humiliation at church, and I am sorrier for that than I know how to properly say. But I wanted you both to know I've corrected what I could. Thank you. Caleb said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. That means more than you know, Margaret. It's the least I owe you both. Sarah would be ashamed of me, I think, for how I've behaved these past weeks. She was never cruel a day in her life, and I let my grief for her turn me into exactly the kind of woman she would have stood up against. Margaret looked back at Ember, who had wandered a few curious steps closer again, drawn by the changed energy in the yard. May I visit him again sometime? Not to interfere, just to remember her through him. Anytime you like, Evelyn said warmly. He'd enjoy the company, I think. He's rather fond of being fussed over. For the first time in longer than Caleb could remember seeing on her face, Margaret Langford smiled small, uncertain but genuine, the first real crack of light through a wall that had stood 5 years unbroken. The change did not happen all at once through the rest of the county. Old habits and old gossip rarely die in a single conversation. However dramatic, but Margaret's public reversal, once word of it spread, did more to shift the town's opinion in a week than any argument Caleb or Evelyn could have made on their own behalf. One by one, the small cruelties began to reverse themselves. The seamstress sent word she had room for Evelyn's mending again this time, with an apologetic note tucked in alongside the offer. The Ladies' Aid Society sent notice of their next meeting, addressed with unusual formality, as though eager to smooth over an oversight everyone involved understood had been no accident at all. Martha Coyle appeared on Evelyn's porch one afternoon, with a fresh preserving pot and an apology so awkward and heartfelt that Evelyn found herself laughing and crying at once, pulling the woman into her kitchen for coffee before either of them had fully finished the conversation. It's strange, Evelyn said to Caleb one evening, sitting together on her porch as the last light faded gold over the ridge Ember grazing contented in the near paddock. How quickly a town can turn once it decides to. Same way it turned against you in the first place. Quick, and mostly without thinking too hard about it. I suppose that's true of most people in the end. Quick to judge if given the excuse, slower to admit when the judgment was wrong. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that had become natural between them these past weeks, without either of them quite marking the moment it started. I don't know that I'll ever fully trust this town again, not the way I did before Thomas died. But I think maybe that's all right. Trust doesn't have to be perfect to be worth something. No? Caleb agreed. It doesn't. They sat together in comfortable quiet a while longer, watching the light fade, watching Ember's dark shape move easy and unhurried across the paddock grass. And it was in that quiet, unhurried moment that Caleb found himself thinking for the first time since Sarah's death, not about what he'd lost, but about what he might still be building. "Evelyn," he said, "I've been thinking about the ranch, about what we talked about the breeding records rebuilding the herd properly, instead of just scraping by season to season the way I have been." He turned to look at her, something serious settling into his voice. "I don't want to do that alone. I don't think I want to do any of it alone anymore, if I'm honest." Evelyn lifted her head from his shoulder, searching his face in the fading light, something hopeful and cautious, moving behind her eyes at once. "What are you saying, Caleb?" "I'm saying I've spent 3 years telling myself I was done building anything worth having. And then a woman came screaming down a creek bank one morning and made a liar out of every part of that story." He reached for her hand, held it steady between both of his. "I'm not asking anything of you tonight you're not ready to give. But I want you to know where my heart's settled. Evelyn, plain and honest, same as everything else between us has been from that very first morning. It's settled on you, on building something together out of what's left of both our broken lives. Whenever you're ready to hear more than that, I'll be here to say it." Evelyn's eyes had gone bright again, the same way they had that first desperate morning when Ember's chest finally rose with a breath deep enough to matter, and she pressed his hand tight between both of hers. "I think," she said softly, "I've been ready to hear it for longer than either of us has let ourselves admit." Neither of them said anything more that evening about exactly what came next. Some things they both understood without needing to speak it aloud deserved to unfold in their own time, without being rushed toward an ending neither of them wanted to hurry past. But something had shifted between them all the same, settled and certain, in a way that no gossip, no closed door, no grieving mother's misplaced anger could touch. The following weeks brought their own quiet rhythm of healing Margaret's visits to see Ember becoming a regular fixture, awkward at first, and then slowly genuinely warm. The town's opinion continuing its steady correction. One reopened door, and one embarrassed apology at a time. The breeding records Evelyn had copied from memory, proving upon careful study to hold real promise for tracing Sarah's father's bloodline to at least 2 other ranches in the county that neither Caleb nor anyone else had thought to connect to that lost herd. It was on a bright, ordinary Tuesday, weeks after the storm of gossip and cruelty had finally begun to properly settle, that Caleb rode into Evelyn's yard with news that made her drop the basket of eggs she'd been carrying in her sudden rush to hear it properly. "The Hendricks place 2 valleys south," he said, swinging down from his horse too fast, words tumbling out ahead of him. "I rode out this morning on a hunch after going through those breeding records again last night. They've got a mare older past breeding age herself now, but her dam's markings match exactly what your father's notes describe for that bloodline. And she's got a granddaughter 4 years old, sound as a bell, carrying the same confirmation clear as day, once you know to look for it. Caleb. Old Hendricks doesn't even know what he's got. Been breeding her to whatever stud was cheapest and closest for the past 2 seasons. No eye at all for what the bloodline's actually worth." He was grinning now, wide and unguarded, in a way Evelyn had rarely seen from him, even in their best moments together. "He's willing to sell her if we want her. Says he's got no particular use for a horse that fusses as much as she does." Fussy is she. Stubborn as sin, according to Hendricks. Wouldn't settle for anybody who didn't earn her trust first. Something in Caleb's expression softened, warm and knowing. "Sounded familiar enough to me that I figured she'd fit right in around here." Evelyn laughed bright and unguarded and swatted his arm, even as her eyes shone with something far past simple amusement over horse bloodlines. You rode 2 valleys on a hunch before breakfast. Couldn't sleep for thinking about it. Same way you couldn't sleep the night you went through your father's ledgers. He caught her hand, pulled her close, the easy affection between them now as natural as the morning light spilling gold across the yard. We're building something, Evelyn. Really building it, not just surviving season to season the way I've been doing since Sarah passed. And I wanted you to be the first to know, because none of it happens without you. Evelyn looked up at him at the ranch spreading quiet and hopeful beyond the fence line at Ember, grazing easy in the near paddock, strong and whole, and living proof of everything a person could rebuild, if they simply refused to let something be buried before its time, and felt something settle deep and certain in her chest, that no amount of gossip or grief or grieving mothers could ever fully unsettle again. Then let's go see about that mare, she said. Sounds like she's waited long enough for somebody to recognize what she's actually worth. The ride to the Hendricks place took the better part of the morning, and Evelyn spent most of it peppering Caleb with questions about the mare's lineage, her temperament, the particulars of her foaling history, until he laughed and told her she'd talk the poor animal's ear off before they'd even gotten a lead rope on her. I like to know what I'm walking into, Evelyn said, unbothered. A horse that's been passed over and undervalued for 2 seasons running doesn't trust easy. I'd rather understand her before I ask her to trust me. Sounds like somebody else I know. Hush. Old man Hendricks turned out to be exactly as gruff and disinterested as Caleb had described a wiry, sun-cured rancher, who looked at Evelyn with open skepticism when she asked to see the mare's teeth and the set of her hocks before any money changed hands. Ain't never had a woman haggle horseflesh with me before, Hendricks said, not unkindly, more curious than offended. Then today's a fine day for a new experience, Mr. Hendricks. Evelyn ran her hand down the mare's foreleg, checked the give of the tendon, watched the animal's ears flick back with wary attention rather than outright aggression. She's not fussy. She's careful. There's a difference, and it's one that's cost you a fair price these past 2 seasons if you've been treating the two the same. Hendricks's brow lifted. That's so. A careful mare raises careful foals provided somebody takes the time to earn her confidence instead of forcing the issue. You've been breeding her to whatever stud stood closest and cheapest, which tells me you never once asked yourself what she actually needed to throw a foal worth keeping. Evelyn straightened, meeting the old rancher's eyes without flinching. I'm not trying to insult your operation, Mr. Hendricks. I'm telling you plainly what I see, because I intend to pay you a fair price, and I'd rather you understand exactly what you're selling before we shake on it. The old man studied her a long moment, then let out a short, surprised bark of laughter. Well, I'll be. Caleb, where'd you find this one? Creek Bank, Caleb said, grinning. Best decision I ever made stopping to listen to her. They settled the price within the hour fare to both sides, and by early afternoon the mare, whom Evelyn had already without any ceremony at all, started calling Juniper on account of the pale, sage-colored dapple across her flank, was walking easy on a lead rope behind Caleb's horse ears. No longer pinned flat with distrust, but flicking instead toward Evelyn's steady voice, with the same wary curiosity Ember had shown that very first week of his life. She likes you already, Caleb observed. She's deciding whether to like me. There's a difference. But Evelyn was smiling, unable to help it, watching the mare's dark eyes track her every movement. Give her a season of proper care, patient handling, good feed through the winter, and I think she'll surprise you, Caleb. I think she's got more good years left in her than Hendricks ever gave her credit for. Everybody deserves somebody willing to look twice before writing them off, Caleb said quietly, and the words carried a weight between them that had nothing at all to do with horses. The weeks that followed folded into each other with a steadiness neither of them had known in years, Juniper settling into the paddock beside Ember, who took to circling the older mare with the puppyish enthusiasm of a colt delighted by any new creature willing to tolerate his company. Evelyn's breeding records, spread across the kitchen table most evenings, cross-referenced against notes Caleb had begun keeping himself clumsy at first, and then, under her patient teaching, increasingly sure. The ranch itself slowly filling back out, not with miracles, but with the unglamorous daily labor of 2 people who had decided together that it was worth rebuilding. Margaret's visits continued too, growing less awkward with each one, until by the time the first hard frost came to the valley, she had become something close to a fixture in their lives. Arriving most Sundays after church with a basket of preserves or a fresh loaf sitting on the porch with Evelyn over coffee, watching Ember grow leggier and bolder by the week, with an expression that had settled finally into something like peace instead of grief worn sharp as a blade. "He's got her spirit," Margaret said one such Sunday, watching Ember toss his head and bolt a wide circle around the paddock for no reason beyond the pure joy of running. Sarah used to run like that too when she was young, before she learned to be careful the way girls are taught to be careful. A small wistful smile touched her mouth. I used to scold her for it. Told her a young lady didn't go tearing across pastures like a hoyden. I regret that now, more than I ever told her while she was alive to hear it. She sounds like she had joy in her whatever anybody scolded her for, Evelyn said gently. She did. I think I forgot that somewhere in the grieving. Forgot that the thing worth remembering about her wasn't the loss but the joy she carried before it. Margaret looked over at Evelyn, something steady and grateful in her face now. You've helped me remember that, Evelyn, more than I know how to properly repay. You don't owe me any repayment, Margaret. Watching you find your way back to peace is repayment enough. It was during one of those quiet Sunday visits deep into autumn, with the leaves along the creek gone gold, and the air carrying its first honest bite of the coming winter, that the conversation turned unexpectedly toward the future in a way that set something new in motion. Have you two thought about what comes next? Margaret asked, watching Caleb and Evelyn from her seat on the porch, the two of them working together at the fence line, checking the last repairs before the snow came. For yourselves, I mean. Not the ranch, not the breeding program. The two of you. Evelyn's hands stilled on the fence rail, color rising in her cheeks despite the cool air. Margaret, I'm an old woman who's already made the mistake of holding my tongue too long about things that mattered, and look what that cost all of us. Margaret's voice carried a wry, self-aware humor, now that had been entirely absent in the woman Caleb remembered from those first terrible weeks. I'm simply asking. You look at each other the way Sarah's father used to look at me 40 years ago, before life wore all the softness out of both of us. I'd think it a shame to waste that kind of looking on uncertainty, when certainty seems well within reach. Caleb glanced at Evelyn, and something passed between them. Not new exactly. The understanding had been building steady between them for weeks now, but suddenly, with Margaret's blunt question hanging in the autumn air, feeling closer to the surface than either of them had let it come before. We haven't rushed anything, Caleb said carefully. Seemed wise given everything the town's already put us through this year. Wisdom has its place, Margaret allowed. But so does not wasting good years waiting for permission from people who've already proven their opinions aren't worth the weight you're giving them. She rose from her chair, gathering her shawl, offering both of them a knowing look that carried no judgment, only affection. I'll leave you to your fence and to whatever conversation you've clearly been circling around for longer than either of you wants to admit. She left them standing there in the gold afternoon light, and for a long moment neither Caleb nor Evelyn spoke the fence rail, suddenly feeling like a very inadequate thing to be occupying their hands. She's not wrong, Caleb said finally. No, Evelyn agreed, quiet. She's not. I've been waiting, Caleb admitted, setting down the tool in his hand, turning to face her fully. Waiting for the right moment, the right words, some sign that you were ready to hear what I've known for months now. But I think maybe I've just been scared, if I'm honest. Scared that saying it out loud makes it real enough to lose. Caleb, let me finish, please. He reached for her hands, held them steady between his own, weathered and sure. I told you once, a long while back now, that you taught me to hope again when I'd sworn off hoping for good. That wasn't just about Ember. It was never just about Ember, not for very long. It was about you standing in my life like a woman who refuses to let anything be buried before its proper time. Not a Colt, not a widow's reputation, not a rancher, too stubborn and too grief-worn to remember what it felt like to want something for himself again. Evelyn's eyes had gone bright. The same fierce, unguarded brightness he'd seen that very first morning, kneeling beside a dying colt in the dirt, with a stranger's fingers pressed to its faint, fluttering pulse. "I don't have anything fancy to offer you." Caleb continued, his voice rough now, unsteady in a way that suited the honesty of what he was saying. "A ranch that's still rebuilding. A herd we're growing back one careful bloodline at a time. A colt who thinks the whole world exists for his personal amusement." A small wet laugh escaped Evelyn at that, and Caleb pressed on, emboldened. "But I've got a whole life left in me that I thought I'd buried 3 years ago, and I want to spend every day of it building something real with you, Evelyn Harper. Not because I need saving, not because you need saving either, because Lord knows you've proven a dozen times over you don't need anybody to save you from anything, but because I love you, and because building a life alongside somebody who chose it freely out of love and not necessity is worth more to me than anything I thought I still had left to want." He knelt then, right there in the dirt beside the fence they'd mended together, months of quiet labor and quieter love folded into every board and rail between them, and looked up at her with a certainty that had nothing left in it of the broken, grief-hollowed man who'd carried a dead colt to a creek bank all those months before. "Marry me," he said, "not because either one of us needs rescuing, but because I can't imagine building the rest of my life with anybody else standing beside me." Evelyn's hands were shaking when she pulled him back up to standing, when she pressed both palms to his face and looked at him with an expression that held every ounce of the fierce, stubborn love that had sent her running barefoot down a creek bank that very first desperate morning. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at once, the word coming out of her without a single second of hesitation. "Yes, Caleb Walker, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, right there in the gold autumn light, with the fence they'd built together at their backs, and Ember watching curiously from the paddock, ears pricked forward, as though he understood in his own small equine way that something important had just settled into place. Word spread through the county fast the way word always did, but this time the spreading carried none of the cruel whispered edge that had once threatened to tear their fragile happiness apart before it had properly begun. This time, the town that had so nearly succeeded in driving Evelyn out for good found itself instead swept up in a different kind of talk, entirely warm, curious, eager, the particular delighted gossip that surrounds any wedding in a small community, starved for good news after a long season of hardship. Margaret, when she heard, wept openly on Evelyn's porch, holding both her hands tight. "I couldn't be happier," she said, her voice thick. "Truly, Evelyn. I know I've no right to claim any part in this joy given how I behaved when you first came into Caleb's life. But watching the two of you find your way to this, despite everything I did to make it harder, it feels in its own strange way like Sarah's blessing reaching through all of it regardless. She'd have liked you standing here with us today," Evelyn said gently. "I believe that, Margaret, truly, grief doesn't erase love, it just asks us to carry it differently. You have a gift for saying exactly the thing a grieving heart needs to hear," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. "I hope you know how rare that is." The wedding itself, when it came in early winter, was a modest affair by any measure a wealthier county might have judged it, held in the small church where Margaret had once humiliated Evelyn in front of the whole congregation. The same pews now filled with neighbors who had over the preceding months slowly and imperfectly worked their way back toward decency. Mrs. Fenwick attended contrite in a way she'd never quite managed to voice aloud, but demonstrated instead through the careful, deliberate kindness of her presence. Hiram Doyle closed the general store for the afternoon so he and his wife could attend, bringing with them a length of fine blue cloth as a wedding gift, an unspoken apology stitched into the gesture more eloquently than words might have managed. Margaret sat in the front pew in the place that might once have belonged to a mother of the bride, weeping freely and without shame. And when the minister asked if anyone present objected to the union, the silence that answered him carried none of the poisoned weight. It might have carried months before only the warm, settled quiet of a community that had slowly and imperfectly learned better. Caleb, standing at the front of that small church in his one good suit, watched Evelyn walk toward him down the narrow aisle in a dress the color of autumn wheat. and felt the last remaining weight of 3 years' grief lift clean and complete from his chest, replaced entirely by something bright and certain, and utterly undeniable. "You came a long way to get here," the minister said to them both, a note of gentle humor in his voice, well aware of everything the county had watched unfold over the preceding months. "Creek bank to altar. Not the usual courtship, I'd wager." "Not the usual anything," Caleb agreed, and beside him, Evelyn laughed through fresh tears, squeezing his hand tight. "Do you, Caleb Walker, take this woman?" He said yes before the minister had even finished the question, drawing a ripple of laughter through the pews. And when it came Evelyn's turn, her own answer rang out clear and unhesitating, filling the small church with a certainty that felt to everyone gathered there like the natural conclusion of a story that had nearly ended in tragedy on a creek bank many months before. They rode home that evening, truly home now, both of them, to the ranch that had slowly, patiently become theirs together, rather than his, alone with Ember trotting alongside the wagon the whole way, unwilling it seemed to be left out of any part of the celebration that had unfolded around him all day. The winter that followed was hard, as winters in that territory always were, but it was a different kind of hard than the ones Caleb had weathered alone these past 3 years, hard shared between two people, instead of carried by one, made lighter by the simple fact of not facing it in isolation. Snow piled deep against the mended fence lines. The stove Evelyn had once nursed a dying Colt beside kept two people warm now, instead of one. Their evenings filled with the quiet, contented work of planning for spring, folding schedules, breeding pairs, the careful, patient rebuilding of a herd from bloodlines nearly lost to drought and neglect. Ember grew through that winter into something Caleb could hardly credit as the same fragile, near-lifeless bundle he'd once carried wrapped in flour sacking toward a shallow grave. By the time the snow finally broke, and the first green pushed up stubborn through the thawing earth, the Colt stood tall and dark and strong, moving with an easy, powerful grace that drew admiring looks from every rancher who passed through the county and happened to catch sight of him in the paddock. "He's going to be something," Caleb said one spring morning, watching Ember run the fence line with Juniper trailing behind at a more dignified pace, the old mare having settled over the winter into something close to genuine affection for the household that had finally recognized her worth. "He already is something," Evelyn corrected, coming to stand beside him, her hand finding his the way it always did now, easy and certain. "He's proof, Caleb. Proof that the world's wrong more often than it likes to admit about what's worth saving and what isn't." "You're not just talking about the Colt." "No," she admitted, smiling. "I'm not." That spring brought its own small miracles, following close on the heels of the larger one they'd already lived through together. Juniper, despite Hendrix's assumption she was past her breeding years, proved otherwise, carrying a foal through the warming months with a steadiness that had Evelyn checking on her twice daily. Her old fear of loss tempered now by hard-won experience, and a partner who checked alongside her, learning the signs, sharing the worry, splitting the long nights of watching between them, so that neither carried the burden alone the way Evelyn once had year after solitary year, before a rancher's dead colt had changed the whole shape of her life. The foal came in early summer, healthy and strong from her very first breath. No desperate creek bank rescue required this time, and Caleb watched Evelyn's face as she cradled the newborn's head in her lap, tears streaming unashamed down her cheeks, and understood in that moment the particular grace of a woman who had spent years losing things she loved, finally getting to witness one arrive whole and thriving instead. "What'll we call her?" Caleb asked, kneeling beside her in the hay, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Evelyn considered the small wobbling filly a long moment, her dark coat marked with the same pale dapple that had first caught her eye on Juniper months before. "Hope," she said finally, quiet and certain. "I think we ought to call her Hope." "Fitting," Caleb agreed and pulled her close, the two of them sitting together in the warm hay with a new life, breathing steady between them, proof upon proof that the worst losses did not have to be the last word on any story, provided somebody remained stubborn enough to keep believing otherwise. The ranch grew from their season by patient season in a way that drew notice from across the county, not merely for its recovery from the hard drought years, but for the particular partnership at the heart of it. a rancher and his wife who worked the land and the herd together as equals in every visible way. Evelyn's knowledge of bloodlines and breeding proving as vital to the operation's success as Caleb's decades of ranching instinct, neither one ever standing in the other's shadow. Young women in the county watching Evelyn discuss breeding strategy with visiting ranchers, who'd once have dismissed a woman's opinion on livestock without a second thought, began to understand something new about what a life could look like, not confined to the narrow expectations that had once nearly cost Evelyn everything, but expanded into something broader, more honest, built on genuine partnership rather than mere endurance. Margaret became a fixture at the ranch through those years, her visits growing so regular that Caleb built her a standing invitation into their weekly rhythm without either of them ever needing to discuss it formally. Sunday afternoons spent on the porch, watching successive foals grow leggy and bold in the paddock. The particular joy of a woman who had once nearly destroyed a stranger's life out of misplaced grief, finding instead a second family to fill the empty space her daughter's death had carved into her world. "I used to think," Margaret said one such afternoon years into their friendship, now watching Ember fully grown, magnificent sire, now to 2 foals of his own graze, easy in the late summer light, that healing meant putting Sarah behind me, moving past her the way people always say you're supposed to move past grief eventually. She shook her head slow. Something peaceful settled deep in her weathered face. I understand now that healing was never about moving past her at all. It was about learning to carry her differently, lighter, with more room left over for loving the people still here in front of me. "She'd be proud of you," Evelyn said, squeezing the older woman's hand, "for finding your way back to that." "She'd be proud of both of you," Margaret said, "for refusing to let anyone convince you that what you'd built together wasn't worth fighting for." The years that followed carried their own ordinary joys and ordinary sorrows. The way any full life inevitably does hard winters and easy ones, foals lost, despite every careful precaution, and foals saved, against every reasonable expectation, the slow accumulating weight of a life built with patience and honest labor, rather than any single dramatic rescue. But the foundation beneath it all never wavered, built as it had been on a single stubborn refusal, one ordinary morning years before, to accept that something still breathing was already lost. Caleb often thought back in quiet moments to that first desperate morning by the creek. The shovel already in the dirt, his own heart already resigned to another loss, in a life that had handed him far too many, when a stranger's voice had torn through his grief and refused to let him finish what he'd started. He thought of how close he'd come to burying Ember before his mother's mare's bloodline could prove years later strong enough to rebuild an entire herd from near ruin. He thought of how close he'd come to burying his own capacity for love and hope, alongside that small still body, before a widow's stubborn insistence on checking for a pulse. Everyone else had already given up searching for, changed the whole trajectory of both their lives. "You saved more than a colt that morning," he told Evelyn once years into their marriage, watching their own children. 2 by then, a boy and a girl. Both of them already showing an unmistakable fondness for the horses that filled their days. Chase each other laughing through the paddock grass while Ember watched over the whole scene with the patient protective air of an animal who understood in his own way exactly what role he'd played in bringing this particular family into being. "I think," Evelyn said, watching their children with a warmth that had never once dimmed since that very first desperate hour by the stove, "we saved each other in the end. Ember was just the reason we finally noticed we needed saving in the first place. That in the final accounting was the truest thing either of them ever said about it. Not a story about a miracle horse alone, though. Ember's survival remained to everyone in the county who'd witnessed it a small and enduring wonder. Not a story about a wealthy family's cruelty overcome, though Margaret's transformation from bitter grief into genuine family stood as its own quiet testament to the possibility of change, however deeply rooted the pain that preceded it. It was at its heart a story about 2 people who had each in their own separate griefs nearly convinced themselves that hope was a luxury the world no longer owed them, and who found in the unlikely shape of a dying colt, neither of them could bring themselves to abandon the stubborn patient courage to try again anyway. The ranch prospered in the years that followed, its herd rebuilt not through miracles, but through the same patient, careful attention that had first coaxed a breath back into Ember's failing lungs. Bloodline traced to bloodline, careful pairing to careful pairing, until the Walker Ranch became known throughout the territory, not merely for having survived the hard drought years, but for having rebuilt itself into something stronger and more thoughtfully tended than it had ever been before the losses that once threatened to end it entirely. Evelyn's reputation, once nearly destroyed by a grieving woman's misplaced fury and a town too quick to believe the worst of a lonely widow, transformed instead into something the whole county came to respect. Without reservation, the woman who could read a horse's worth better than any man in 3 counties, whose counsel on breeding and care was sought by ranchers who'd once refused to so much as sell her eggs. She never forgot the bitterness of those weeks when doors closed against her, one by one, and she made certain in the years that followed that no other woman in that county faced the same isolation without someone willing to stand beside her. Becoming in her own quiet way a fierce advocate for anyone, the town seemed too eager to cast aside on the strength of gossip alone. And Ember lived out his long years, exactly as his name had promised, from that very first desperate morning, a small spark, refusing to be extinguished, growing into a horse, whose bloodline would come to define the Walker Ranch's reputation for a generation sire to foals, that carried forward the very same stubborn vitality that had first been coaxed back into his own tiny failing body by a widow who refused to accept a doctor's verdict, and a rancher brave enough to trust her instinct over his own grief-numbed certainty. He grew old eventually, the way all living things must. His dark coat silvering gray at the muzzle. His gait slowing from the fearless gallop of his youth into something more measured and dignified. But even in his final years, Caleb and Evelyn's children, and eventually their grandchildren, would find him standing patient at the paddock fence each morning, ears pricked forward, waiting for the same low, familiar voices that had once murmured him back from the very edge of death decades before, on a morning nobody who lived through it ever fully stopped marveling at. Margaret lived long enough to see those grandchildren born long enough to watch the bitter grief that had once consumed her transform season by patient season into the quiet, contented joy of a woman surrounded by family she had very nearly destroyed her own chance at knowing. She spoke of Sarah often in those later years, but never again, with the desperate, grasping sorrow that had once driven her to cruelty, only with the warm, settled affection of a mother who had finally learned how to carry her daughter's memory as a gift, rather than a wound folded gently into a life that had, against every expectation she'd once held, grown rich and full again despite everything. And on quiet evenings, decades after that first desperate morning by the creek, Caleb and Evelyn would sometimes sit together on the same porch where he'd once knelt before her, with his heart laid bare, watching the sun fall gold and unhurried over pastures full of horses descended from a bloodline nearly lost to drought and grief alike, and think back on how close the whole of it had come to never happening at all. One shovel, one shallow grave, one moment's hesitation that might have ended everything before it ever properly began. "Do you ever wonder?" Evelyn asked him once, her hair gone silver. Now her hands weathered from decades of honest work, but no less sure than they'd been that very first morning. Checking a stranger's Colt for a heartbeat nobody else believed was there. What would have happened if I hadn't looked out the window at exactly the right moment? If I'd slept a few minutes longer, or turned away before I saw you riding for that creek? "I try not to," Caleb admitted, taking her hand, the way he'd taken it 1,000 times since, familiar and certain, and never once grown less precious for the familiarity. "Some things I think are better left as the mercy they turned out to be, rather than picked apart for how easily they might have gone the other way." "That's fair," Evelyn said, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the horses graze easy in the fading light, generations now removed from the small, near-lifeless Colt who had started it all. "I suppose the only thing that truly matters in the end is that I did look out that window, that I didn't turn away." "No," Caleb agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her silvered hair, his voice steady with the particular certainty of a man who had built an entire life's worth of joy on a single stranger's stubborn refusal to accept a false ending. "You never once turned away. Not from Ember, Not from me. Not from any single soul who needed somebody brave enough to check for a pulse the rest of the world had already given up searching for. And that in the end was the whole of the story worth telling. Not merely of a colt saved against every reasonable expectation, nor even of a rancher and a widow who found in each other the courage to build something neither of them believed the world still owed them. It was the story of a single stubborn act of compassion, one ordinary morning on an ordinary creek bank that reached forward through years and generations to prove a truth. Neither grief nor gossip, nor even death itself could ever fully unmake that what appears silent, what appears finished, what the whole world has already agreed to bury and forget, may simply be waiting patient, faint and unbroken for someone brave enough to kneel down, listen closely, and refuse to mistake that silence for the end.